This is no longer just SAP GUI automation. A request arrives by email. The Mobility Engine validates it. An approver approves it. SAP starts automatically. VBA executes the MB21 transaction. The result comes back by email. And when the job is finished, SAP closes automatically. Finally, the listener restarts ready for the next request. Let me show you how this entire workflow works. Now let's see what happens when the first request arrives. The user sends an SAP Mobility request by email. The Mobility listener is continuously watching the designated Outlook folder. As soon as the request arrives, the listener picks it up and passes it to the validation process. The request is checked, and when the required information is valid, the system creates a unique mobility ID. This ID will now follow the request throughout the entire workflow. Email rightward arrow listener rightward arrow validation rightward arrow mobility ID. Notification and rejection. The request has now been registered with its mobility ID. A notification is sent to the approver. The approver receives the notification through Gmail and, in this demonstration, chooses to reject the request. I simply respond to the approval message with the command reject. Let's see what the Mobility Engine does with this response. Rejection process. The listener detects the rejection command and identifies the corresponding mobility ID. It then looks up the original request in the mobility queue. Because the command is reject, the system does not proceed to SAP. Instead, the request is marked as rejected. A rejection notification is generated and sent back to the requester. The original approval email is also moved to the archive. Notice something very important here. SAP was never opened. The rejection was handled entirely within the Mobility Engine. MobilityQueue after rejection. Here we can see the result in the MobilityQueue. The request now carries the status rejected. The mobility ID provides the link between the original request, the approval decision, and the final status. This gives us a complete audit trail even though SAP was never touched. See, I am highlighting the rejected row. A new request. Now let's run the other side of the workflow. I create a completely new SAP request in Gmail. This request contains the material, quantity, plant, storage location, cost center, unit of measure, and movement type required for the MB21 transaction. The email is sent to the Outlook account monitored by the mobility listener. New Mobility ID. The new request has arrived. The listener detects it and starts the same validation process. The request passes validation, and once again the system generates a unique Mobility ID. From this point onward, the Mobility ID becomes the identity of this particular automation request. Approve command. The approval notification is now received in Gmail. This time, instead of rejecting the request, I respond with the command approve. That single command changes the path of the entire workflow. The mobility engine will now move from approval into actual SAP execution. Approval detected. The listener detects the approve command. It extracts the mobility ID and searches the mobility queue for the corresponding request. The system confirms that the request is waiting for approval. The status is changed from pending approval to approved. The approval email is then moved to the archive. Now the request is ready for SAP execution. SAP activity begins. And now we reach the interesting part. Because the request has been approved, the mobility engine starts the SAP execution handoff. The system checks SAP readiness. If a usable SAP session is not available, the engine can start SAP and obtain a new session. Once SAP is ready, the mobility ID moves into the executing state. MB21 execution. The mobility engine now transfers the approved request into the MB21 staging area. Here we can see the actual values being loaded. Material, quantity, unit of measure, plant, cost center, storage location, and movement type. The existing SAP automation procedure then takes over and performs the MB21 transaction. SAP result. SAP has now completed the transaction. The reservation has been created successfully. The automation verifies the result and links it back to the original mobility ID. This is important because we are not simply assuming that SAP completed the transaction. The system checks the result before declaring the mobility request successful. Excel updates. Back in Excel, we can now see the result reflected in the MB21 sheet. The reservation number and material document have been populated. At the same time, the corresponding entry in the mobility queue is updated to success. So the same mobility ID has now traveled through the complete process from email request, to approval, to SAP execution, and finally to a verified result. Gmail success notification. And finally, the requester receives the success notification. The email contains the mobility ID, the success status, and the SAP result. So the requester doesn't need to monitor Excel. They don't need to watch SAP. They simply receive the final result through email. The complete picture. And this is the real power of the SAP Mobility Engine. The same communication mechanism can lead to two completely different outcomes. If the approver rejects the request, the system stops the process, no SAP activity takes place. If the approver approves it, the Mobility Engine continues automatically into SAP, performs the transaction, verifies the result, updates Excel, and communicates the outcome by email. The Mobility ID connects every step of this journey. From email, to validation, to approval, to SAP, and finally back to the user. Conclusion. I would not end with a generic like and subscribe. For your technical audience, make the ending about the concept. This is no longer just VBA automating SAP clicks. It is VBA acting as a communication layer between Outlook, email, Excel, and SAP. And this is only the beginning of what the Mobility Engine can do. If you want to see where this architecture goes next, stay tuned for the next episode.